has come. It's taken me 4 years to learn. I just lose my voice in October around here. And then this year's got extended into November a little bit. Or maybe it's because I'm coaching too much on Saturdays and I'm just too vocal as a coach, but that's a whole other story. It's all good. So we'll just keep a slight eye on the clock. So my grandmother was a widow for almost 40 years, and she traveled the world with my grandfather, who was a career United States Navy. Hey, Marcos. Career United States Navy Medical Corps officer. And in traveling the world, she had amazing stories. So part of her memoirs, which I'm not reading today, include when my grandfather was stationed on the Yellow River, and there was a U.S. ship and a British ship way up the Yellow River, and their adventures there and birthing her first child in Shanghai, and then she bore twins in the Philippines. Those boys didn't live, so they're buried in the National Cemetery there in the Philippines, the U.S. Base there. And then my mom, you're going to hear about here, my mom's name is Betsy. She was born in Philadelphia when my grandfather was stationed there for a little bit. And then my Aunt Dixie gets, at the end of the story here, she gets born on the U.S. side of things. But my grandmother was pregnant on December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor, at Pearl Harbor, which you're about to hear about. So there are a few names you just need to know. So there's Grandma, and she's telling the story. And there are parts, I share this with some of the forum people, and there are parts of her story which could have been edited out, and we decided to just let this be raw, just raw memoir. And for those of you spouses of military people, my guess is you can relate to almost everything she says. So this was orally given in February 19th, 1986. And my grandma and my aunt were down in Victoria, Texas, off to go birding the next day. And so here's where the story begins. Yes, after we left China, to go back a little bit, we went to Philadelphia, where Betsy, my mother, was born. And then after 2 years in Philadelphia, we went up to Boston, where Daddy, my grandfather, got his boards, medical boards, in radiology at Mass General Hospital, studying under the Dr. George Holmes. And after that, we were ordered to Honolulu. This, of course, was the second time we got to Honolulu. This time we went on the Lurline, a commercial ship. Lurline? You were on that one too? Okay.
No, but
I've been on the sister ship.
So it's spelled here Lurline.
That's correct.
So it's spelled right, but I didn't get it right. Okay, Lurline, got it. Virginia and Betsy, Daddy and I, the first time we were there, we met with the Vinges, with the Leos and the Aloha Band and all that. This time we arrived, and as I said, it was 1940. We were met by Ned and Fluff Walsh, Vivian and Jerry Carter, B and Bobby Kelly, and the Lays from all them. They made reservation for us at the Pleasanton Hotel. Anyone know that? Which is right across from the Punahou School.
Punahou.
All right, this is going on Facebook. I can't pronounce a word in any language, let alone English, let alone this. So, all right, you all just pipe it up so the world knows how it's supposed to be done. That summer, and I think it must have been mid-July or early August, the Honolulu papers kept the public informed on the progress of the night blooming cereus, the flowers? Cereus. Finally, the nights came when they bloomed for about a week. They were at their peak, and the crowds and crowds of people, mostly resident Hawaiian people, would take torchlights, flashlights, and walk along the walk. There was a stone wall enclosing the campus of the school, and you'd walk with the flashlights to see the night blooming. And then there was a question, does it only bloom at night? Only bloom at night, truly. And they would grow great, big, beautiful blooms, sort of a cactus looking, maybe it's a cactus family plant. I don't know. Cactus in the family system that I come from, it means Texas, because they're all from Texas. Anyway, at this time, Daddy was in the radiology department at the Pearl Harbor Hospital, which was at the naval base 7 miles from downtown Honolulu. In those days, it was just a 2-lane highway out from the city of Honolulu to the Navy base. I haven't been back since the war, but imagine it's at least a 4 or possibly 6-lane highway now. In those days, it was almost a country road, going out there to the main gate and into the base itself. Virginia, that's my aunt, went to the school across the street. We finally found a house in Kahala, K-A-H-A-L-A? Kahala, which is right across the street from Diamond Head, a lovely residential section of Honolulu on Ocean Shore. Well, Virginia was developing allergies at the time, so we thought maybe we better do better in a damper climate. So we moved to the Willie Street in the Nuuanu, N-U-U-A-N-A? Nuuanu Valley. So we lived up there then for the rest of the time we were in Hawaii. Dixie was born on June 10th, 1941. Just a week before Dixie was born, Daddy was transferred from the hospital to the light cruiser, Honolulu. Dixie was born at the Queen Hospital in Honolulu. Oh, I got that wrong. Okay. And I think in those days, you had to spend about 10 days in the hospital when you had a baby. And I'd order my breakfast or lunch or dinner. Well, you still do when you check off what you want in the hospitals. They always had poi, and I ordered it poi, because I thought I had to taste this stuff, and I think I ordered it every meal. But I never did get to thinking it tasted like anything but library paste. The radio was the only entertainment I had. I saw an article in the Waco, Texas, paper not long ago that Ted Lyons, or Leo Lyons, whoever he was, and the title was Hut, Sut, and Other Memories of 1941. Well, what they played other than the Hawaiian music on the radio was Hut, Suit, and the Rilla Hot Raw. And the other one was Three Little Fishies at the bottom of the pond. We sing that in a nursery school now, says my aunt. Swim, Said the Mother Fish was another one. Those are the only 2 songs I really remember, except I think I said before, maybe I didn't, of course, radio was our only outlet there. There was no television. Hawaiian music day and night, night and day. At first you thought you couldn't stand it, but after a while you got to like it. You know that this was before Hawaii was a state, don't you? It was the territory of Hawaii in those days. I couldn't tell you what the population was or anything like that. We used to have picnics on the ocean. Fort Debussy, Debussy was down not far from the Royal Hawaiian Hotel on that strip of the beach. But it was, of course, private for military. So we usually had our picnics down on the beach, and our neighbors usually had their children with ours. Virginia, the oldest of the girls, who had always been afraid of the water up in Massachusetts because it was so freezing cold, would get in there and we couldn't get her out. And Betsy, my mom, was in a life jacket and would bob along in that water like a cork. And we, many a time, had to swim out to get her to bring her back to shore. She used to tell me those stories. It was a nice, leisurely, lovely existence. The climate was so beautiful. I think the Hawaiian climate probably averages around 80 degrees, and it never much less than 70 or 75, and never much more than 85. They did have a rainy season, but it wasn't like the ones in the Philippines with downpours. You did have a rain in the middle of the day, well, every day. Well, a little bit. I remember going downtown to the post office, and it would be raining, and I'd walk across the street to the bank or someplace else. Never thought of wearing a raincoat or an umbrella or a rain hat. It was just a lovely soft rain, and it would only last a few minutes, and you'd be dry a few minutes later. Another thing, when we moved from Kalala Boulevard, we were a distance from the school. So either the Army or the Navy bus would pick up the dependents' children. I think it must have been an Army bus. The military children, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, they'd come by the front of the house and Virginia would walk out, and all the kids did, barefoot, with their shoes over their arm to get on the bus. They had to put their shoes on during school hours, of course. It was a great thing, like jeans are today, to go barefoot. I've been at dances in the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which in those days was the loveliest one on the island. The young people all dancing barefoot. The flowers and the birds of the islands we won't go into because I don't remember enough of the names of them. But we did have in front of the Willie Avenue house, a sort of like you have a planting of holly in front of this house, a narrow bed of birds, a paradise, and they were so much fun because you could bring them in the house and make such fun flower arrangements of them. I took flower arranging from a Japanese woman there. You could have all the flowers in the world. It isn't like here where you have to scratch to find enough flowers. We took that Japanese top-bottom triangular arrangement. Then I also took Chinese cooking from a Chinese woman. I have that cookbook autographed still that she had written. We had to skin chicken feet. The Chinese use every single bit of their animals, their chickens particularly, and that was fun. Now Virginia and Betsy were taking hula lessons. I think Little Grass Shack was one that they danced the hula to, and we have a movie tape showing them dancing when my sister Margaret was visiting us before the war. I had gotten them little grass skirts and the halter tops made of tapa cloth. Tapa cloth is made from the bark of Hawaiian mulberry tree. It was brown and white pattern, and you see that pattern a lot now. But anyway, some of the other music that the Hawaiian music that I should mention was Lovely Hula Hands, Beautiful Hawaii, Little Brown Shack. I've also mentioned the Hawaii Nei, N-E-I, and that was the one that Virginia learned in first grade. Rainbows in the sky. Rainbows all the day. Where is there a country like Hawaii Nei? Then I took started a course. It must have been after Dixie was born. It must have been in the fall sometime. I started to take a course in something like woodworking or upholstery or something because I was making a little chair out of an apple box and upholstering it. That, of course, finished abruptly at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Our house on Willie Street was a 2-story house, 3 or 4 bedrooms, I've forgotten which. Each bedroom had a screen door on it. The house built on a little creek where there were loads and loads of, what do you call those little guppies or minnows that the children used to collect? All their friends would come over to get fish for their fish bowls. After Dixie was born, whenever she'd cry, Virginia and Betsy would come running up the stairs and open the door to the room and say, "Shut up!" You poor little Dixie. And then slam the door shut, which made Dixie cry even more. It was really such pleasant living out there in those days. But there was still rumors of war and uneasy times. Things weren't quite as easy as they should be. In the Pacific, just like when we were in China, there were troubled times. Ed Compers came by on a ship. We met him down at the pier. He was coming out to give some lectures on orthopedic surgery or something. Oh no, he said there's no chance of war. He had just come from the States. We didn't believe him. The thing that made us uneasy was that so many of the families out there whose husbands in the medical corps and the line officers would get aboard ships one day and not come back. Well, there at sea is the only answer we'd get. We didn't know where at sea, how long at sea. This didn't happen to me, but it happened to many of our friends. I was fortunate, in case that did happen, that Daddy had had part of his pay sent to me directly, so I would get a check from the Navy directly, whether he was at hand or not. But many of those husbands did not do that. So when they went to sea, the wives had no money. And we who were ashore would pool their resources and least pay the rent for them. The poor wives, and sometimes those men didn't come back for 3 or 4 months. Well, that wasn't normal procedure. So you almost knew that something was not quite right. Then there were rumors of carrier pigeons and Japanese activities down at the tea houses. The Japanese tea houses down in Hawaii were lovely places to go out to dinner, just like Japanese restaurants are today. There were many of the rumors like that. We had 2 Japanese girls as maids. One, Nuboko, I always thought she was a spy. I mean, later, not at the time, of course. She was an older girl and looking and very Americanized, intelligent. The other girl was one we loved so, was the little 14-year-old called Harriet. I don't know what her Japanese name was. Her family came to the house to thank us for hiring her. She'd work after school on Saturdays and Sundays when Nuboko didn't work, and of course was wonderful with the children because she was so young. When we left Hawaii, she and her mother had made a whole assortment of Japanese kimonos and clothes for baby Dixie and given us a doll, a Japanese doll. I think it was probably quite a family treasure because it was a little small thing and it had different wigs, evidently the different hairdos, and a symbol for the Japanese. And I think the doll was 3 or 4 of them. Anyways, our household was pleasant, and next door to the house to us was Mrs. Kelly, and Mrs. Kelly ran a nursery school. After Dixie was born, Betsy kept looking over there. The first time we brought Dixie home, we found Betsy sitting in her room in the rocking chair, and we said, "What's wrong, Betsy?" And she said, "I just don't feel good." A little jealous. But anyway, looking out her bedroom window, there was the garden at Mrs. Kelly's home and the nursery school, and Betsy longed to go there, so we entered her in the nursery school. You're the only one, speaking to my aunt, who didn't go to nursery school. And you're still there. Never got out. That was the nice arrangement because I could look out at recess and check on her. She didn't need checking because Mrs. Kelly was a very responsible person. And I think a good nursery school teacher, not sophisticated as they are today. Remember, my mom was a nursery school teacher when she said that. I can't remember for the life of me what her husband did, but he was not in the military. Of course, there were a lot of American civilians over there. They were American citizens, so whatever he was doing, they had lived there for years, and I assume remained there. No, they didn't. I remember they moved back to California. Well, that's what I think. There's a question. The Japanese maid that you had, the older one, could she have picked up some information from home? Then the answer. That's what I think. Not from us, because medical people didn't have that much, but line officers, I should think so. I think they probably, but not many, I'm sure. But they were probably some Japanese spies in the homes. But there would be selected homes where they thought they'd get more information. They probably could have picked up someone saying so-and-so on such and such a ship is gone, and we've got to get some money for his wife and family. So it could have been from our house as well as anybody else. I'd never been certain about Nuboko, but she never came back after the attack. Harriet stayed with us until we left the islands. Nuboko, whether she disappeared, I don't know. I can't remember that little detail, but I doubt I fired her. I could have, but we didn't. I don't think we had much feeling that she was a spy. I didn't tell you that the newspapers there were the Honolulu Advertiser and the Star Bulletin, which was, of course, where we got all of our news other than the radio. The ships listing the passengers coming in and all that. But anyways, it was a pleasant life. I don't know what else to say about that except I suppose you want me to go to Pearl Harbor itself. My aunt says yes, then we can always come back. The ship was tied up. The light cruisers were tied up on the pier at the harbor. The Honolulu with 2 light cruisers. One doctor served the 3 cruisers at night and on the weekends, so they alternated their duties. Daddy was supposed to come off duty on Sunday, December 7th at 8 a.m. Saturday, I had been in the commissary, so the day before, to get a crate. I think it was pet milk to be used for Dixie's formula, and I had it in the back of the car because I couldn't carry the whole crate of milk, and little Harriet certainly couldn't, and Nuboko didn't work weekends. I guess so. Anyways, I had that in the trunk of the car. We had decided to have a picnic on the other side of the island because it was another one of those gorgeous days, just like we're having here down in Texas now. Warm and balmy, but not as hot. I had packed a picnic lunch. Colors sounded at 8 a.m. in the morning, so we drove out there and through the main gate and over to the pier where the officers' club was right there on the water too. We parked the car on shore facing the water. There was a road that went to the left up to the ship's berths where the Honolulu was docked. There were many ships out in the harbor and other places, but this particular spot, which I can show you, she had a map, I can't show it over the tape. See there? There, where? Here was the officers' club, right down there. This is where we parked, right there. So right to our left, or 200 or 300 yards, was the Honolulu and the other ships. The receiving station landing was where the cruiser would come in so Daddy could come off it. And yes, he did. He just came down the ramp. He didn't have to take a small boat ashore like the other ones out in the water would. The little gigs were going back and forth, back and forth. That was one of the things you kids would enjoy. We'd sit there and watch the little boats carrying the boys in and out, back and forth. There was a lot of little small boat activity in the harbor. While we were parked there, Daddy came onto the top of the deck where we could see him and recognize him. We were close enough for that. And he was waiting because he couldn't leave the ship until the colors at 8 a.m. Colors is where they tooted their horns and raised the flag. I had seen him on the deck. Well, I suppose the children had seen him too. And then these planes started coming over. They were so low overhead that I could actually see the pilots looking out like this. With the dark glasses and white scarves, typical pilot. And then these, it looked like huge cigars dropping into the water. At first, I didn't really know what it was, and then finally I realized, my word, this is awful. We're being attacked. I didn't really think it in those words, but Virginia said, "Mother, why is your face so white?" There I was, just directly under these planes with 3 little children in my car, my husband 300 to 200 yards away on the deck of the ship. These cigars were torpedoes that go underwater to their targets, and once they started exploding, I thought, oh, I don't think I can stay here. So I drove back as far as I could along to the gates of the tennis courts, which were just behind the club, and parked the car and locked it. Farther back again, about 200 feet, was the bandstand, like any park used to have, and under that I could see these soldiers who were in that place under the bandstand. I think they kept their instruments under there in the banding days. So first I went into the club. Well, that was so lightly built, it was shaking, so that I was afraid of that. And then the only people there were the Filipino stewards who were cleaning up from the night before, and they were green-faced as I was, so I beat it out of there, and I told Betsy and Virginia to hold hands and run for those boys over there under the bandstand. Of course, here I was with Dixie in my arms and Betsy and Virginia with their little feet just pumping. One of the boys came out and grabbed them and pulled them in, and I went in with Dixie. So we sat through the raid of Pearl Harbor, the rest of the raid, under there. And of course it was good as far as observer's point, because the boys knew every ship. All were attached to certain ships in the harbor and were trying to get to their ships when the alert went out in town for all personnel to report for duty. They were coming into the harbor in streams, so they'd say, "There goes this ship and that ship." And that was the first one that went down. Goodness, the smoke and the noise. And then I decided Dixie was going to be deaf. Today, I'm the one who's deaf, but I covered her ears with a shawl. I had Betsy and Virginia hold their hands over their ears, which they didn't do. But the noise is unbelievable. And when I think that men go into war today, I don't think so much of their being shot, maimed, as I think of the enduring the noise. And I think that probably is what shell shock is, the result of that unbelievable noise. So anyway, the boys would report which ship was being hit. And they of course knew this by this time that my husband was on the Honolulu. So one of them was standing at the doorway, and the rest of us would be back because there wasn't room for everybody in the doorway. And the boy said, "Well, there goes the Honolulu." I said, "Oh, my word." And somebody else said, "Shut up, you fool. That's her husband's ship." Anyways, a little later, this thing came over in 2 waves. But the time between the 2 waves wasn't enough time to get much action. But at one time in the lull, a shore patrol came along, and when he saw the sailors, he said, "Get the hell out of here. Get to your ships." Well, they were perfectly comfortable, but they didn't question it. Off they went. I don't know whether they survived or not. And then he saw me, a woman with 3 children in the middle of the war. He said, "What in hell are you doing here?" I said I came down to meet my husband. He remembered me, because after the second wave he came with, I must say, with a rather sullen chaplain who was being sent back to town for something, and evidently the chaplain wanted to stay there where the action was. So he had to take this woman and 3 little children and whatever else he had to go to town for. So we went back out to the main gate, past Hickam Field, which was literally one smoke stack. Hickam Field was right there as we went out the gate, on your right, going towards town. Well, we got back to Willie Street, and of course the chaplain took off as soon as he could. In the meantime, I forgot to tell you that while we were waiting out about the raid, one of the boys from the hospital who had been in the x-ray department there, I think they were beginning to get people ashore from ships. So this boy said, "I think we ought to have some sort of first aid right here on the shores." I said, "Well, here's my car keys and take it." So we took the car, went to the hospital, and got emergency supplies. And I think later he returned my car. Yes, he returned it to me about 10 days later. He said they had used it to transport some of the wounded too. I told him to be sure, and I told him to be sure and lock it when he had the car. Middle of the war, tell me someone to lock the car. And had to give him some advice, and that's all I could give. But anyways, so I was without a car, and we got to the Willie Street. Everybody, of course, was out on the street, in the middle of the street, looking at all the smoke over there in Pearl. Of course, I was the first person who had any first-hand information, and my information was not good news. We had a little grocery store on the corner about a block away. People think of eating first. Well, I do too. But there wasn't a thing left on the shelves of that store. I was back within 2 or 3 hours of the beginning of the raid of Pearl Harbor, and people had gone and just bought everything in the store. First reaction, let's get some food and preserve ourselves. Well, by that time, the phones were still working, so people, Navy wives, were calling each other. So one of them, well, what's her name? Was a nurse. She, of course, had 3 children, but she said, "I think I have to get out there." They were calling for nurses and doctors, and she said, "I think I ought to go down to the hospital." I said, "Well, bring your children. over here, and we'll get together and take care of them while you go out. So she dumped her 3 kids there, and B. Kelly and her son, who was a teenager, and 3 or 4 other wives and their children came over to the house on Willie Street. We were offshore a little bit, and for some reason, maybe I had the biggest house as far as the floor space and being able to sleep on the floors. But anyways, we tried to sleep that night, but in the meantime, we were told not to show any lights. We had no time to put up blackout curtains. This was just before Christmas, so I had a lot of red tissue paper. So we put red tissue paper over flashlights just with rubber bands, and everybody had brought a flashlight with them. I was changing diapers for Dixie with a flashlight covered with red tissue paper, and all night there was shooting. I think the Americans were shooting at each other. There was not much heavy firing, but gunshots every now and then. And there were rumors, of course, as I mentioned, of carrier pigeons before there were rumors that Japanese had landed on the beaches and that they were raping and looting, but nobody could prove anything. There were also rumors of Japanese in the pineapple fields spying. I think that is a true one, and also in the sugarcane. I would assume the real spies got off the island very shortly, because I don't remember any trials of any real spies being tried or convicted. The Japanese were, as you know, put in reservations during the war in the United States, as well as in Hawaii, and some of them been loyal American citizens for years. This was a time of absolute panic. Some of the Japanese were 2nd or 3rd generation Americans, but in those days, you could almost understand the panic. And there were disaster committees. They established martial law right away as soon as everybody got control. There was the governor, general, or whatever you call that man. The FBI, of course, came in trying to find you now. Then there's a question. You must have been listening during that time. Oh yes, the radio was going. This was on a Sunday, and there was an announcement that evening that President Roosevelt was going to make an address the next morning, which would have been Monday in Hawaii. I had a house full of people sleeping on all floors, and oh, Robert Kelly and Bees Kelly's son must have been the age of Mark, or about that age, had a gun, and didn't he carry it with him? I don't know what B thought that boy was going to do with the gun to protect us. We gathered round the radio. I can't remember. It must have been early morning, our time. So when she told the story, I was 10 years old. I can't remember it. Must have been early morning, our time. And it must have been mid-morning, early afternoon Washington time when he made the declaration of war. So after this night, there was nobody slept, of course. We listened to President Roosevelt make what's known now as the Day of Infamy Speech when he declared war. By this time, of course, you know war was going on in Europe. We were not in it, for the European War had started in 1939. So at least the Americans were in the war with the English and the French, in the war against Germany, and there against the Japanese in the Pacific. The war itself in Europe had not affected us much there in Honolulu, but once Japanese attacked us, we knew it was war. I didn't tell you the reason for the rumors and actually finding Japanese spies in the cane fields and the pineapple fields where they were up on the hills there, and they could get a good view of the whole harbor, and so they could report the activities of ships. Now the actual raid on Pearl Harbor, I think John wrote that up in one of his high school papers. I think there's no use going over all that again, because he probably did a better job than I would. That's my brother she's talking about. And all the statistics and all that there was no repeating. This was just my own personal observation. I think the same day as the president's speech, this information, the censorship notice came out about civilian and military personnel and how they would write their letters, because every letter back home had to be censored and they had to be mailed unsealed. I've saved that because I thought it was interesting. It's sort of an antique by now. She actually had one of her letters. They did really very well. It was the same day after the president's speech that B, who had this older teenage son, was the only one free, so she got all the addresses from the rest of us and went down to the cable office and sent cables to our families back in the States. We'd take one cable per person, so it was up to the person receiving the cable to let the rest of the family know. She sent the cable to my family in Oak Park, that's in Chicago, and they got in touch with Dixie Lynn down in Victoria, Texas. Grandma Wood, in Dawson, Texas, had died, but that time because Grandma Wood had died by that time because she died in July of 1941. So I sent to Oak Park, and they let Dixie Lynn know, and Dixie Lynn let Frank know. That's my great uncle. Anyway, they knew they had survived that. Of Johnny's survival, I was not a bit sure, but I didn't mention any of that. We only could write one line, one sentence. It was a few days, it could have been a few weeks after the raid, that they had the memorial service in the Punch Bowl. Sorry, that is handwritten here. Which is the natural crater up on the hill on the side behind the city of Honolulu, is a national cemetery for previous American wars, and it was absolutely the most beautiful service. I don't think they had any bodies to bury, but I'm not sure. Maybe they did have some. Well, certainly the ones they got to the hospital and didn't survive. But anyways, that's another one for those gorgeous Hawaiian days in the morning. Was Daddy home by then? Oh, I hadn't heard from Daddy in all this time. So it's been 10 days. I'll tell you when later. So I took the children and went out with all the wives, and of course, I thought I was a widow. So we went out. So the punchline is my grandfather survived. I thought I was a widow. So we went out and sat on the hillside and watched the beautiful service with the taps, and with the sound echoing in the breeze. It was lovely. Now I was still without a car, and I thought I was without a husband, and rumor finally got back through us, some man who got in touch with his wife to say that the Honolulu had a near miss and was going to be patched up so we could go to sea, but it wasn't going to be able to sail right away, and that they didn't think any personnel were lost. Amazing. And shortly after that, I got my car back from that courtsman. He said, yes, Dr. Wood was aboard the Honolulu, and he was all right. The Honolulu was the flagship of the Admiral Kamal's cruiser force, and it was moored at berth 21, and one bomb struck the pier 15 feet from the ship's side at frame 40, whatever that means, and exploded underwater and caused flooding and some damage. And that was why no personnel were hurt, because the damage was to the bottom of the ship. My birthday, could it have been my 35th? Anyway, 18th of December, 1941. That was my birthday. Yes, I think I was 35, and that means awfully young to have endured all that I had in the past 10 years. Remember, the previous years were in China, up the Yellow River, and then the Philippines. Anyway, up to the door comes Dick Barrett, who's the ship's dentist, and Lucky Dick was the one that was assigned to go into town and get what either needed supplies or messages or interviews with authorities or whatsoever, and he was the one that got off the ship. Nobody else could leave the ship, and he'd gotten an armload, as I remember, of anthems from Daddy for my birthday.
Anthuriums.
But my grandfather thought to give him flowers to give to my grandmother
For her birthday.
10 days after the bombing, while I hadn't seen her.
She didn't know he was alive.
Just when I thought I knew how to take care of my wife. I'm sure said I can't go over to her house and give her these from her husband and then not take anything myself. So he brought me a box of candy. So I had quite a birthday after all. Question. Now you still didn't have a house full of people, did you? No. By this time they were scattered. We'd calmed down some. Messages were going out to the military dependents to get out, and that they were scheduling them to call up wherever you were supposed to and tell them how soon you could get ready to go, which I didn't do because I knew the Honolulu couldn't sail. I thought I might as well stay in the island as any place else for as long as I could. So we were leading more and more less normal lives. Virginia, I think, went back to school. We went back to Mrs. Kelly's. Weren't you afraid of another attack? Well, I think we were afraid, but there wasn't much we could do about it. So practical. And then, of course, gradually the war went over to Midway Islands, and that's where all the trouble was then. Why the Japanese didn't go ahead and take the Hawaiian Islands, I don't know, but I don't think the military personnel do. But anyway, Daddy came back after Pearl Harbor. It must have been 2 weeks. He came back very shortly after Dick had shown up for my birthday. Then he told us a couple of stories that I thought were kind of cute, that I made a note of. He said that when the attack came, you know that awful relief that you're still afloat. He said Dick was running into the dispensary there, where Daddy was treating some boy who had gotten a minor injury. I mean hurt, but not life-threatening. Dick came in and said, "Take me out, coach. I'm hurt bad." He wanted to get out of the war. He didn't really. So there were a lot of jokes and fun. Of course, what else can you do at a time like that? In the meantime, the people were leaving the islands. Daddy never came home, except for a few hours. Never spent any length of time with us, but he could come in and have a little visit. The Honolulu finally got orders to leave sometime, and I think it must have been mid-February 1942. So there I was with this 7-room house, and we're having to get rid of most of the furniture, though the Navy would take back anything we wanted to, because we had a lot of because they had to get ballast for the ships. They came out loaded with ammunition and supplies. For some reason, I don't know why now, I had a sale for a lot of the household things, and B. Belly came over to supervise the sale. I think B must have talked me into that, and for some reason, I had to leave the house, and nobody was there but Virginia. And I told her the prices were marked. It's like a 7-year-old girl. I think she sold about $30 or $40 worth of things. A 7-year-old Virginia in charge of the sale. Finally, it was time we went on an army transport called the Henderson. We had gone to China, I think I told you, on the Chamont, which was a transport. These must have been named after famous army generals because they went over to England later on. Years later, on the army transport named after Maurice Rose, B took us to the ship. She had my car. Where was our car? She had a car, sorry. Daddy took the car. B took us out with loaded bags, baskets, and children. You know what, I'm looking at the clock, and I'm gonna just... So we went back on the Henderson, and the reason we went this time was because the Honolulu was going to go back to the Mary Island shipyard.
Yeah.
And
It's up in Oakland.
Oakland, right? Okay.
Or San Francisco.
That's in California near San Francisco. San Francisco, and we had a travel in convoy. The Honolulu was a light cruiser. There were several destroyers and a couple freighters and our passenger ship. We zigzagged to avoid the submarines. Bruce Lemire was on that ship at the way back to Pearl. He's the one that met us in China, so we met in unusual places. Anyways, we had absolute blackout at night on the ship. You had to do everything in the dark. If you went on the deck, which would be light enough because of the moonlight, you couldn't hear a radium dial watch. You couldn't even wear a white scarf. Serious business. I forgot to tell you that after the raid in Pearl, the sailors were in the summer uniforms, whites. So Daddy had the cooks brew all the coffee, and they dyed the crew's whites, and the officers too, in coffee.
That's interesting.
Guess they didn't have the tan. Okay. Who knew? I think you guys get the idea.
Thanks for sharing.
So they ended up in Oakland area, and then my grandma hopped in a car and then drove the kids to Texas. My grandfather didn't go anywhere, and then she would get phone calls from him out of nowhere, and he'd get like 2 days free, and he'd come down to San Diego. My grandma would meet him at the Del Coronado,
Oh, okay.
and a couple times my mom and her sisters went along with it too. So there you go. Some of you can relate to this in your own ways, whether you served or whether you were a spouse. Yes.
We moved there in '46, so it was shortly after, but, they said that there were some, like high school boys who were just curious to know what was going on. And there was a curfew at night, but they would go out at night, and
Yep.
some of them almost got shot because they
Yep.
thought they were spies. So
Yep.
that could have been some.
So I'll explain what she wrote. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. I mean,
And the other thing that happened was both Punahou and Iolani, and I'm not sure, and not others, but some of the private schools, the military moved in because they didn't have any offices, everything got bombed.
Yep.
And they had their offices there, and they also took care of some of the wounded up in those two schools.
wow.
Oh, you dropped something, Mark.
I probably did. Oh, it's the tissue.
Oh.